Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to try and do something that I think feels almost impossible. We're going to try to look past one of the most famous images in the history of pop culture.
It's an image you absolutely know.
Oh, for sure. You've seen it 1,000 times. It's on T-shirts, worn by people who have probably never even heard a single note of his music. It's on posters in dorm rooms. If you looked up the word punk in the dictionary, this face would be there.
It's the sneer, that curled lip, the spiky black hair that looks like it was cut with, I don't know, a lawnmower, maybe? The padlock necklace. We are talking, of course, about Sid Vicious.
Born Simon John Ritchie. And that's really the paradox I want to grapple with today. Because on one hand, you have this global icon of rebellion. He is the complete embodiment of everything dark, decadent, nihilistic.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, if we're being totally honest, and I know this might upset some of the purists out there, if you actually look at his musical contributions, well, they're practically non-existent.
Minimal would be a very polite way of putting it. But I think if you just dismiss him as, a mannequin or some kind of marketing gimmick, you are missing a much deeper, much, much darker story.
Right.
This isn't really a story about music at all. It's a tragedy. It's about a chaotic 21-year-old kid who was basically strapped into a rocket by the music industry and just launched directly into a brick wall.
I love that image. A rocket into a brick wall. It feels so accurate because the velocity of his life was just insane.
Yeah.
He died at 21. Most people are just finishing college or figuring out their first job at that age.
And he had already become a global superstar, a suspected murderer, and a corpse, the whole arc in just a few years.
Unbelievable.
Ja Wobble, who was one of his closest friends growing up, had a very specific phrase for it. He called Sid a kamikaze pilot. He said the people around him, the band, the management, they strapped him in, patted him on the head, and just sent him off to die.
That is so heavy. So our mission today really is to figure out who that pilot was. We want to find the human being who's buried under all that leather and hair gel. We have to talk about his mother, who is a character straight out of a gothic horror novel, and the toxic love affair with Nancy Spungen, and of course the legal mess at the end.
And we have to look at the actual evidence, not just the myths, but the police records, the biographies, the accounts from people like John Lydon and Steve Jones. Because when you strip away the punk legend, what you're left with is a story about really neglect, addiction, and a desperate need to be anyone other than Simon Ritchie.
So let's go back, way back. Before the Sex Pistols, before the heroin, before any of it. Who was Simon Ritchie? Where does a kid like this even come from?
He comes from Lewisham, southeast London, born May 10th, 1957. And if you think the chaos started when he joined the Sex Pistols, you'd be wrong. The chaos was there from, the delivery room. His father was a guardsman at Buckingham Palace.
See, that sounds so fancy. Guardsman at the palace. You picture stability, discipline, shiny uniforms.
Well, it was a total facade. His father was also a semi-pro trombone player, which is an odd detail, but he left the picture almost immediately, just vanished. He provided zero financial support. So it was just Simon and his mother, Anne MacDonald. She later became Anne Beverly. And honestly, we cannot understand Sid Vicious without first understanding Anne Beverly. She is the architect of his entire reality.
I was reading about their time in Ibiza. And this wasn't a normal mom and son go on holiday kind of situation, was it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
This was the late 1950s and early 60s. So Anne takes Simon to Ibiza in Spain. Back then, Ibiza wasn't the clubbing capital of the world it is today. It was a hippie outpost, a very bohemian, kind of lawless place.
A bit rough around the edges.
Very. And Anne wasn't working a 9-to-5. By most accounts, she was selling marijuana just to get by.
So you have a toddler running around while his mom is dealing weed to beatniks in Spain. That's a wild image.
Exactly. It was a completely unregulated childhood, no structure, no boundaries, nothing. Eventually, they moved back to England, bouncing around Tunbridge Wells in East London. But that instability just followed them. And then the drugs got harder.
Right.
By 1973, when Simon is a teenager, Anne isn't just a free-spirited bohemian anymore. She is completely consumed by a heroin addiction.
And that is such a pivotal detail. His mother was a heroin addict before he was.
Yes. It was completely normalized in his household. Friends from that time claimed she was so checked out she didn't even realize he was attending college. And this leads to what I really consider the psychological big bang of Sid Vicious's life. The moment that, you could argue, broke him.
The ultimatum.
The ultimatum. Simon turned 16 and, just consumed by her own demons and struggles, kicked him out. But she didn't just say, you need to find your own place. She told him, and this is a quote, "It's either you or me, and it's not going to be me. I have got to try to preserve myself, and you just fuck off."
It's either you or me. I just can't imagine that level of rejection. You're 16 years old, and your only parent looks you in the eye and basically says, I choose me. You're disposable.
It's absolutely devastating. It creates this void inside you that you'll spend the rest of your life desperately trying to fill. And Simon's response was just heartbreakingly simple. He said, "I've not got anywhere to go." And she effectively just said, "I don't care."
That explains so much, though. It explains why he latched onto John Lydon so tightly. It explains why he couldn't let go of Nancy later. He was just terrified of being abandoned again.
Absolutely. He was always looking for a protector, for a family. And we know he was suffering. While he was at Kingsway College around the same time, he actually told a counselor he was contemplating suicide. This wasn't just, teenage angst. This was deep clinical distress.
But Kingsway College is also where he finds his tribe, so to speak. This is where the whole cast of characters starts to assemble.
Yes, enter the Four Johns.
Which I have to say sounds like a barbershop quartet, but it was actually this little gang of misfits.
It really was. You had John Lydon, who would soon become the infamous Johnny Rotten. You had John Gray. You had John Wardle, who Sid later nicknamed Jaw Wobble because of his drunken pronunciation of his name. And then you had Simon John Ritchie, who was going by John Beverly at the time.
So what were they actually doing? Were they, making music yet? Or just causing trouble?
Not really making music. They were just existing. They were squatting in these derelict Victorian houses in London. We really have to paint the picture of London in the mid-70s. It wasn't the wealthy, polished city you see today. It was great. It was still bombed out in places. It was filled with trash strikes and unemployment. These kids were just bored out of their minds.
Like completely broke.
Utterly destitute. Lydon and Sid used to go busking in the subway stations, but they couldn't play anything. Sid would have a violin with one string or maybe a tambourine, and they would just scream Alice Cooper covers.
Wait, Alice Cooper? Not exactly punk rock.
No, but it was theatrical. They do I Love the Dead, things like that. They sounded so unbelievably horrible that people gave them money just to make them stop.
That's amazing. Their business model was based on annoyance. Here's 50 pence, please just shut up.
It was performance art, really.
But we have to address the name. Sid Vicious. It sounds like a wrestling villain. It sounds like a guy who carries a switchblade. But the origin story is, well, it's significantly less intimidating.
It is the great irony of his entire life. It involves a hamster.
A hamster? You're kidding.
No, John Lydon had a pet hamster named Sid. He named him after Sid Barrett from Pink Floyd, the original psychedelic casualty. One day, this little hamster bit Simon on the finger.
Okay.
And Simon, reacting to the bite, just exclaimed, "Sid is really vicious."
And that stuck. From a hamster bite.
Lydon seized on it immediately. Sid Vicious. He just dubbed him that right on the spot. But here is the absolute key. Lydon gave him that name as a total joke. It was ironic. At the time, Simon was this sweet, kind of goofy, slightly dim kid. He wasn't a tough guy at all. Calling him vicious was like calling a giant guy tiny.
That's fascinating. So the whole persona, the whole identity that would define him, it started as a joke. But then he spent the rest of his very short life trying to live up to a hamster's reputation.
Exactly. He grew into the name, or maybe the name just swallowed him whole. He started to armor himself with this character.
So we're in the pre-Pistols era now. This is 1975, 1976. The punk scene is just starting to bubble. You've got Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's shop, Sex, on the King's Road. This is ground zero for the whole fashion side of it. The bondage pants, the safety pins. And Sid is just, hanging out.
He was a fixture there. He was the ultimate fanboy. He just soaked up the aesthetic. He was actually trying to be a musician, to be fair. He formed a band called The Flowers of Romance with Keith Levine, who later went on to Public Image Ltd. He also played drums for Susie and the Banshees at their very first gig at the 100 Club.
Was he any good on drums? Or was it just noise?
By all accounts, it was a complete cacophony. I think they played the Lord's Prayer for about 20 minutes straight. It was all about the impact, not the skill. But there's a story involving Chrissie Hynde around this time that shows just how chaotic and directionless his life was.
Chrissie Hynde from The Pretenders.
The very same. She was an American expat in London, trying to make it in music, but she was facing deportation. She needed a work permit to stay, so she came up with a plan to marry Sid.
A green card marriage, basically.
A British citizenship marriage, yeah. And she offered him £2.
£2. That's what the price of a pint of beer. He sold his bachelorhood for £2.
He needed the money for food or cigarettes or something. He agreed. They actually went down to the registry office to do it. But, and this is just classic Sid, the office was closed because it was a bank holiday. They couldn't get it done.
So he was foiled by a bank holiday. It's like a plot from a bad sitcom.
It is, but it shows his personality. He was just a leaf in the wind, willing to go along with absolutely anything.
But he did have these moments of intense, almost manic focus. I remember reading about the Ramones album.
This is a really crucial anecdote, and I think Chrissy Hine told the story in a documentary. The first Ramones album came out, and it just changed everything. It was fast, simple, all downstrokes on the bass. Sid decided he wanted to play bass exactly like Dee Dee Ramone, so he got a bunch of amphetamine speed and stayed up for 3 days and nights straight.
Just playing along to the record over and over.
Non-stop, just grinding away at the bass in his squat, trying to learn that rhythm. And on one hand, you can look at that and say, wow, that's incredible dedication. But on the other hand, look at the method. 3 days on speed, that's not practice. That's a manic episode. That is drug abuse masquerading as artistic discipline.
It sets the pattern for his whole life, doesn't it? Everything he did had to be extreme. He couldn't just, take a lesson. He had to stay up for 72 hours on meth.
Precisely. And that intensity, that willingness to self-destruct is exactly what Malcolm McLaren was looking for.
Which brings us to February 1977. The Sex Pistols are already notorious. Anarchy in the UK is out. They've been on the Bill Grundy show. But they have a problem. Their bass player, Glenn Matlock.
Glenn Matlock was the anomaly in the Sex Pistols. He was a competent, even gifted musician. He wrote a lot of the music. He was relatively sober. And he liked the Beatles.
And McLaren hated that.
McLaren wasn't managing a band. He was managing a revolution, or at least the appearance of one. He wanted chaos. He wanted headlines. Matlock was he was too safe, too musical. So McLaren manufactured this story that Matlock was thrown out for liking the Beatles, and he brought in Sid.
But why Sid? If he couldn't play, why him of all people?
Because of the look. McLaren said, and this is another famous quote, "If Johnny Rotten is the voice of punk, then Vicious is the attitude." Sid looked amazing. He was tall, skinny, pale, covered in these little scars and safety pins. He looked like a disaster waiting to happen. He was the perfect visual.
He was a human billboard for the movement.
Exactly. But bringing him in changed the chemistry of the band entirely.
Yeah.
It shifted them from a, pretty good rock band into a traveling circus of actual violence.
Let's talk about that violence.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a tendency to romanticize it, to say, oh, that was just punk rock. But when you look at the specifics of what he did, it's actually quite disturbing.
It is. It's not performance art. Take the Nick Kent incident. Nick Kent was a very prominent music critic for the NME. He was at a show at the 100 Club. Sid was there, high on speed, wearing his usual gear. And he felt Kent was blocking his view of the stage.
Okay, so a normal person would, tap him on the shoulder, say, excuse me, can you move a bit?
Sid pulled out a rusty motorcycle chain that he kept in his pocket, and he just whipped Kent across the head with it.
A rusted chain. That's practically a medieval weapon. You could get tetanus just looking at that.
It opened up a huge gash on Kent's head. Blood was everywhere. It wasn't a punk statement. It was assault with a deadly weapon. And then you have the incident at the Damned concert.
Right, the glass throwing.
He was drunk, high, just thrashing around in the crowd. He threw a glass at the stage, supposedly aiming for Dave Vanian, the singer of the Damned. He missed. The glass hit a pillar, shattered, and the shards flew into the audience. A girl was blinded in one eye.
You blinded a fan.
Yes, he went to the Ashford Remand Center for that. And this is where I really struggle with the poor, innocent Sid narrative. Yes, he was troubled. Yes, he was exploited. But he was also genuinely dangerous. He was hurting innocent people.
That's a really important distinction to make. It's easy to see him as a victim of the industry, and in many ways he was.
Yep.
But to that girl who lost an eye, he's the villain of the story, full stop.
Absolutely. And the band, Lydon, Steve Jones, Paul Cook, they were watching this happen. They saw him spiraling. But the chaos sold records. The press loved it. Every single time Sid hit someone, they got a front page story.
So he's in the band. They go into the studio to record the album. Never mind the bollocks. This is like the holy grail of punk albums. It's a landmark record. And Sid, he isn't even on it.
Barely. This is the great secret of the Sex Pistols. When it came time to actually record the bass parts, Sid was in the hospital with hepatitis.
From the drug use.
Almost certainly from dirty needles, yes. So he was laid up in the hospital. Steve Jones, the guitarist, ended up just playing on the bass parts on the record. He just overdubbed them himself. So when you listen to God Save the Queen or Holidays in the Sun, those iconic driving bass lines, that's the guitars playing.
So the icon of the band, the guy on the shirt, isn't even playing the music he's famous for.
He is a ghost on his own album. Now, to be fair, he did try. He came out of the hospital and tried to lay down a bass track for the song Bodies, but he was so rusty and out of time that they just turned his track way down in the mix and used Jones's part anyway.
There's always been this rumor that at live shows they would just unplug his amplifier. Is that true?
Oh, it happened frequently, especially early on. The sound engineers, or sometimes even Steve Jones, would just cut his feed to the PA system. So Sid would be up there thrashing around, sweating, posing for the cameras, thinking he was tearing the roof off the place, and nobody could hear a single note he was playing.
Wow. That is so psychologically devastating if you think about it. He's not a musician. He's a prop. He's a mascot.
Well, he was a mascot who could bleed. That's what made him valuable.
And then, into this already incredibly unstable mix, walks the ultimate catalyst, Nancy Spungen.
Nancy. If Sid was a bomb, Nancy was the lit match. She was an American groupie who came to London with the explicit goal of hooking up with a Sex Pistol. She actually aimed for Johnny Rotten first.
She tried to get with Rotten. I didn't know that.
She did, and Rotten wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. He found her abrasive, loud, just trouble. But Sid was lonely, Sid was deeply insecure, and Sid was very easily led.
Can you describe her background a bit? Because she gets villainized so much in the story, you know, nauseating Nancy. But she was a pretty damaged person herself.
She really was. She had severe mental health issues from a very young age. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, though you have to remember diagnoses back then were tricky. She was a heroin addict, she was a hustler, she had been a stripper, a prostitute, a drug runner. She was a survivor, but a deeply chaotic one.
And when the two of them got together, it just became this closed loop of destruction.
They called them the Romeo and Juliet of punk, but it was strictly the tragedy part. It was a profound codependency. Sid liked feeling needed. He would play nursemaid to her when she was sick from drugs. And Nancy liked having control. She would procure the heroin and start to manage his life.
But it was incredibly violent, wasn't it, their relationship?
Extremely. They fought constantly. I mean, physical fights, punching, scratching, throwing things. They shared a bizarre fascination with knives. But they were also completely inseparable, and the rest of the band just hated her.
Why? Was it just because she was annoying, or was it something deeper?
It was because she was isolating Sid from them. She was whispering in his ear that he was the real star, that the band was holding him back. And more importantly, she was accelerating his heroin use from a sort of occasional thing to a full-blown daily habit. It got so bad, Malcolm McLaren actually tried to have her kidnapped.
Kidnapped? For real?
He formulated a plan to grab her, shove her in a car, and force her onto a plane back to New York, just to get her away from Sid and the band. But it never worked out. Sid would have never let her go.
So this toxic train wreck of a relationship then heads to America, January 1978, the big U.S. tour.
The tour that killed the band, it was an absolute disaster from day one. Warner Brothers, their U.S. label, demanded that Sid clean up before the tour. They didn't want a junkie on the payroll, so they put him on methadone.
But methadone doesn't get you high. It just stops you from getting sick from withdrawal.
Exactly. So he was irritable, he was in withdrawal, and he was drinking very heavily to compensate. And worst of all, from his perspective, Nancy was banned from the tour.
So he's alone, sick, angry, and in a foreign country.
And they booked them into these cowboy bars in the Deep South, places in Texas and Oklahoma. McLaren wanted a culture clash. He wanted to see rednecks versus punks. He wanted a fight.
And Sid delivered that fight.
Oh, he did. In Dallas, the tension was just unbearable. Before the show, backstage, Sid took a razor blade and carved the words, "Gimme a fix," into his bare chest.
Give me a fix.
Yeah, deep cuts, bleeding down his stomach. And he went out on stage like that, covered in blood and sweat, and he grabbed the microphone and just screamed at the audience, "You bunch of redneck cowboy faggots."
In 1978 Texas, that is basically a suicide wish.
The crowd went berserk. They threw beer cans, bottles, food, anything they could find. Sid was covered in spit and blood. It wasn't a concert. It was a riot that happened to have a soundtrack.
And that energy just completely drained everyone. It couldn't have been sustainable.
It broke them. By the time they got to San Francisco for the final show at the Winterland Ballroom, it was all over. Sid's bass wasn't working half the time. He was barely standing. Johnny Rotten looked at the crowd, then looked at his band, and realized the whole joke was over. That's when he delivered that famous line, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?"
And he just walked off stage.
Band over. Just like that.
But Sid's personal drama was just peaking, wasn't it? The band breaks up, and what does he do? He overdoses almost immediately.
On the plane, or right before getting on it, he went into a coma. When he woke up in the hospital in New York, the doctor gave him a very, very specific warning. He told him, your liver is shot. If you don't quit drinking, you will be dead in 6 months.
6 months. That's a direct warning.
Sid died almost exactly a year later.
So post-Pistols, Sid is now in New York. Nancy is effectively his manager, and they move into the Chelsea Hotel.
Room 100, on the first floor.
Now, the Chelsea Hotel is legendary. You know, Bob Dylan lived there, Leonard Cohen, Janis Joplin. But by 1978, what was it actually like?
It was a complete dive. It was decaying. The carpets smelled of mildew and old smoke. It was not a glamorous place anymore. And Room 100 became a full-on drug den. Dealers coming in and out at all hours. Nancy was trying to book gigs for Sid at places like Max's Kansas City, but he was just a total mess.
I have to ask about the My Way cover, because that's his other big legacy moment, isn't it? The one thing he did on his own.
It was recorded for the Great Rock and Roll Swindle movie, and it is, in my opinion, a masterpiece of nihilism. He takes this Frank Sinatra anthem of self-assurance and personal triumph and turns it into a violent, sneering joke. In the video, he pulls out a handgun and shoots the audience. It just sums up his entire philosophy. Burn it all down.
But back at the Chelsea, reality is setting in. They're running out of money. They're calling Nancy's parents in Pennsylvania, begging for cash. Nancy is telling people she has kidney failure just to get sympathy money.
They were drowning. And then we get to October 11th, 1978, the last night of Nancy's life.
Walk us through it. What do we know?
There was a small party in Room 100, a few friends, a few dealers coming and going. Sid took a massive amount of Tuinal.
Can you explain Tuinal for a second? It's not a drug we hear about much anymore.
It's a barbiturate, a heavy downer. It was known on the street as a rainbow because the capsule was half blue, half orange. It is a very, very heavy sedative. It basically just shuts your brain off. And Sid took about 30 of them.
30. 1 or 2 would put a normal person to sleep. 30 should stop your heart.
It knocked him out cold. He was completely comatose on the bed for hours, and sometime during the early morning hours of October 12th, Nancy Spungen was stabbed in the bathroom.
A single stab wound.
1 wound to the abdomen. She bled to death on the bathroom floor. The knife was identified as a Jaguar K11 hunting knife, and Nancy had actually bought it for Sid a few days prior on 42nd Street.
So this is the central mystery. Sid wakes up the next morning, finds her body, and calls the front desk. The police arrive. What does he tell them?
He was hysterical and still heavily drugged. His statements were all over the map. First, he apparently confessed, saying something like, I killed her because I'm a dirty dog. Then he recanted and said, I never meant to hurt her. Then he tried to claim she must have fallen on the knife. And finally, he just settled on, I don't remember.
And honestly, if you've taken 30 Tuinals, I don't remember is probably the most truthful statement of the bunch.
That's the core of the defense's argument. How could a man who is completely comatose stand up, get a knife, stab someone with precision, and then pass out again without a single memory of it?
So what are the other theories? Because Malcolm McLaren swore up and down that Sid was innocent.
McLaren's theory, and it does have its supporters, is the robbery theory. There was a lot of cash in that room earlier in the night. Sid had just been paid for a gig at Max's. When the police arrived, the money was gone.
So a dealer or some other thief comes in.
Finds Sid passed out on the bed. Nancy is in the bathroom. She catches them stealing the money. They stab her and run. It's a plausible scenario.
Are there any specific names attached to this theory? Any suspects?
The most prominent name that always comes up is a guy named Rockets Redglare. He was a Lower East Side character, a drug dealer, a part-time actor. You might have seen him in the movie Big. He was at the apartment that night. He was the one who supplied the Tuinals. Some people claim he admitted to the murder years later on his deathbed, but it's all hearsay. There was also another guy named Neon Leon who lived down the hall and was found with some of Sid's leather gear later on.
But the police didn't really investigate these other people.
Not seriously. They had the boyfriend, they had the murder weapon that belonged to him, and they had a confession. However shaky, for them, it was case closed.
So Sid gets arrested. He's charged with second-degree murder. But somehow he makes bail.
Virgin Records, Richard Branson's company, put up the money, $50,000. They got him out. But Sid was he was completely broken.
And this is where the story just becomes a slow-motion car crash. He's out on bail for killing the woman he loved, and he immediately tries to join her.
He tried to commit suicide just days later. He smashed a light bulb in his hotel room and used the jagged glass to slash his arms. He was rushed to Bellevue Hospital, the psychiatric wing.
And even after that, he wasn't done with the violence.
No. Once he healed up, he was back out in the clubs. In December, he was at a club called Hurrah. He gets into an altercation with Todd Smith, that's Patti Smith's brother. Apparently, Sid was flirting with Todd's girlfriend. Todd told him to stop, and Sid smashed a bottle and jammed it into Todd's face.
Well, he's out on bail for murder. It's just unbelievable.
It's pathological self-destruction. The judge, understandably, revoked his bail. He was sent to Rikers Island.
And Rikers is a notoriously tough place.
Yeah.
Especially for a skinny British punk rocker.
It was hell for him, but in a strange way, it also saved his life, at least for a little while. He was forced to detox. No heroin, no alcohol. He spent about 7 weeks there. And when he came out on February 1st, 1979, he was clean. He had gained weight. He actually looked healthy for the first time in years.
February 1st, the day before he dies.
His bail was reinstated. He was released from Rikers. His mother, Anne, was in New York by then to look after him. And his new girlfriend, an actress named Michelle Robinson, hosted a small gathering at her apartment on Bank Street in Greenwich Village to celebrate his release.
A welcome home party.
But the very first thing Sid wanted when he got there was heroin.
After being clean for almost 2 months, his tolerance would be at 0.
Exactly. And this is the danger zone for every single addict. A dose that would have just gotten him high before is now lethal. He asked a friend, a photographer named Peter Gravel, to go score for him. Gravel brought back some heroin.
And his mother, Anne Beverly, she's there at the party. Does she try to stop him?
This is the most chilling part of the entire story for me. She didn't stop him. Some accounts even say she helped him administer it later in the night when he wanted more. She told people at the party, "Oh, he's fine. He knows what he's doing."
That's not just negligence, that's monstrous.
It is. So Sid took a hit. He nodded off on the couch. Everyone just thought he was sleeping it off. Michelle Robinson and his mother, Anne, eventually went to bed.
And the next morning?
The next morning, February 2nd, Anne went to wake him up. He was cold. He had overdosed in his sleep. He was dead at 21.
Just 4 months after Nancy.
Gone. Both of them.
There's this story about a suicide note. A death pact.
Yes. Anne Beverly produced a piece of paper a few days after his death. She claims she found it in the pocket of his leather jacket. It read, "We had a death pact, and I have to keep my half of the bargain. Please bury me next to my baby. Bury me in my leather jacket, jeans, and motorcycle boots. Goodbye."
That sounds very cinematic. Do you buy it? Is it real?
I'm deeply skeptical. It just sounds a little too perfect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A bit too Hollywood ending. Anne Beverly had a vested interest in making this look like a romantic tragedy rather than what it probably was. A gritty, sad, accidental overdose. If it was a suicide pact, it's Romeo and Juliet. If it's just an overdose, he's just another junkie who died on an apartment floor.
And he didn't get his wish. He wasn't buried next to Nancy.
No. Nancy was Jewish. She was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Pennsylvania. Her family wanted absolutely nothing to do with Sid. They blamed him, correctly or not, for her death. So Sid was cremated.
But there's a legend about the ashes, isn't there?
The legend says that Anne Beverly traveled to Pennsylvania, found the cemetery, and secretly scattered Sid's ashes over Nancy's grave in the middle of the night. So they were reunited in death against the family's wishes.
So even his funeral arrangements ended up being an act of trespassing.
It fits the story perfectly, doesn't it?
I want to end on a slightly lighter note, if that's even possible with this story, before we wrap up. There's an anecdote involving Freddie Mercury that I think just perfectly encapsulates who Sid really was.
Oh, this is a classic. It's 1977. Queen and the Sex Pistols are both recording in the same studio complex, Wessex Studios in London. Queen is in one room recording News of the World. The Pistols are in another recording Bollocks.
Two completely different universes colliding.
Totally. So Sid, drunk, wanders into the control room where Freddie Mercury is sitting at the piano. And Sid sneers in his best punk voice and says, "Oi, Freddie, have you succeeded in bringing ballet to the masses yet?" He was mocking a quote Freddie had given in an interview.
Just trying to be the tough guy, trying to get a rise out of him.
And Freddie, who was much stronger than he looked, just stood up very calmly. He looked at Sid and said, Simon Ferocious. He deliberately got the name wrong. Simon Ferocious. And then he grabbed Sid by the lapels of his leather jacket and physically marched him out of the room like he was a naughty schoolboy.
Simon Ferocious. I love that.
And Sid was apparently terrified. He didn't know what to do. It just shows that when he was confronted by a real personality, by real talent and confidence, his whole act just crumbled into nothing.
But that is the perfect summary of his entire life, really.
Yeah.
A lost boy in a costume.
Exactly.
So we've looked at the mom, the hamster, the music, the murder. When you step back from all of it, what is the takeaway? Why do we still care about Sid Vicious 40-plus years later?
I think we care because he represents the ultimate limit of rock and roll. He is what happens when you take the live fast, die young slogan to its most literal, ugly conclusion. He was a creation. He was a suit of armor that Simon Ritchie put on to survive his childhood. But in the end, the armor just ended up crushing him.
He was the face of punk, but he was also its first and most famous casualty.
He was the sacrificial lamb for the whole movement.
And the mystery of Nancy's death.
It will never be solved. Legally, the case died with him. Was it a drug-fueled murder? Was it a botched suicide pact? Was it a robbery gone wrong? We will simply never know. But the lifestyle they lived guaranteed that one or both of them wasn't making it out of that room alive.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. If Sid hadn't died that night, let's just say he survived the overdose, he goes to rehab, he eventually does his time for the Todd Smith assault. What does a 40-year-old Sid Vicious look like? Does he become a reality TV star like Ozzy? Does he work at a gas station? Or does he just fade away?
It's so hard to imagine, isn't it? He was so perfectly designed for destruction. I'm not sure the person, Simon Ritchie, could have ever survived the character Sid Vicious. I think one of them had to go.
That is a haunting thought. Simon Ritchie couldn't survive Sid Vicious.
No, I don't think he could.
We're going to leave it there. If you want to understand the chaos, go listen to Nevermind the Bollocks. But when you hear that roaring sound, just remember, the bass player on the album is the guitarist, and the guy on the t-shirt is a ghost. Thanks for diving deep with us.